You know those moments when life feels like a surreal sitcom, and you're the butt of the joke? This wasn't one of them. It was more like a twisted psychological thriller, where the cheerful DJ is the harbinger of doom. I wasn't a night owl by choice. Work deadlines had piled up, so I'd spent hours staring at spreadsheets and sipping cold coffee in my dimly lit home office. Around midnight, I needed something to keep my brain awake. Music wasn't cutting it, so I tuned into a local late-night relationship advice radio show. The host had one of those smooth, easygoing voices that made even the worst caller sound like they were just quirky characters in a rom-com. Most of the stories were amusingly absurd, couples arguing over pineapple pizza, people debating the right time to move in together. I wasn't paying much attention until a voice came on that stopped me cold. It wasn't just familiar, it was unmistakable. My wife, Emma, had a way of speaking that was impossible to miss. Her cadence, her tone, even the nervous little laugh she gave when she wasn't sure what to say. At first, I thought I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. But as she started describing a complicated situation with someone she deeply cared about, my hands froze on the keyboard. She spoke about her uncertainty, how she felt torn between two parts of her life, and how one choice would break everything. My heart started pounding. Was this some kind of joke? A coincidence? I told myself it couldn't be her. After all, Emma was asleep upstairs, or so I thought. But the longer I listened, the more my gut told me the truth. She wasn't just sharing random feelings. She was confessing. I sat there in stunned silence as the host offered generic advice about following her heart and prioritizing honesty. Emma thanked him and hung up, leaving me alone with the sound of my own racing thoughts and the hum of the radio. That night, sleep didn't come. Instead, I replayed her words over and over in my head, dissecting every syllable, searching for answers. The morning after hearing that voice on the radio, I was a wreck. Sleep-deprived, mentally unraveling, and trying to convince myself it wasn't Emma. Maybe it was someone who just sounded like her. Maybe I'd imagined it entirely. But the words, the tone, the little quirks, it all lined up too perfectly to ignore. Emma greeted me like any other morning, a sleepy smile and a quick kiss before heading off to her weekend yoga class. But now, even her smile seemed suspicious. Was it genuine, or was it hiding something? I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself not to overthink. But every moment of her absence felt heavier. Why had she described herself as torn? Why did she call her situation complicated? And who was she talking about? My brain spiraled through every possibility, from harmless misunderstandings to full-blown betrayal. I replayed her routines in my head, trying to pinpoint any red flags I might have missed. Was she acting differently lately? Had she been more secretive with her phone? The more I thought about it, the more things started to click. Like the time she'd stayed late at work, saying she had back-to-back meetings. Or the recent uptick in her weekend yoga sessions, which had apparently grown so intense that she couldn't even make time for brunch with me afterward. As the hours passed, my suspicions turned into a plan. I needed proof, something solid to confirm or deny what my gut was screaming at me. My first step was simple but effective. I decided to check the radio station's archives. Most of these late-night shows recorded their broadcasts for listeners to replay. It took me hours to find the right episode, and when I did, my stomach twisted into knots. The voice was clearer this time, undeniable. It was Emma. Her words were haunting in their specificity. I love my partner, but there's someone else who makes me feel alive in a way I've never felt before. I could almost hear the smile in her voice, that painful mix of guilt and exhilaration. It wasn't just a confession, it was a window into a side of her I didn't recognize. And that terrified me. I sat there, headphones in, staring at the paused audio wave on my screen. There was no denying it anymore. Something was happening behind my back, and Emma had shared it with the entire city before sharing it with me. The next step was inevitable. I needed to know who the someone else was, and more importantly, how long this had been going on. But I wasn't going to ask her outright. Not yet. If she could keep secrets, so could I. By the time Emma left for her yoga class, my mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand an explanation for what I'd heard on the radio. But another part the quieter, more calculating side, whispered that I needed to tread carefully. If she was hiding something, a direct confrontation might drive her to cover her tracks. I needed proof, hard, undeniable proof. I started with the basics. Emma's routine suddenly felt like a minefield of inconsistencies. Her yoga classes had become more frequent over the past few months. She used to come home flushed and energized, chatting about poses she'd nailed or new friends she'd made. Lately, though, she came back quiet, distant, like she'd been somewhere she didn't want to talk about. I decided to test the waters. While she was out, I went to her closet and checked her gym bag. The first thing I noticed was the faintest trace of cologne, a scent that definitely wasn't mine. Her yoga mat, usually neatly rolled and slightly worn from use, looked pristine, as if it hadn't been unrolled in weeks. My pulse quickened. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Or maybe I was staring at the cracks of a lie so carefully constructed that I hadn't noticed it crumbling until now. I needed more. I remembered the radio broadcast, her confession about being torn between two lives. Who was the other person? And how deep did this go? Desperation pushed me to do something I'd never done before. I grabbed her laptop, which she'd left on the kitchen counter. My hands trembled as I opened it, half hoping I wouldn't find anything. But her browser history was a goldmine of clues. The first search that stood out was from 2 weeks ago. Best places for a secret getaway near the city. My stomach churned as I clicked through the results. Then there was an email confirmation for a hotel reservation, one I hadn't known about. The name on the booking was hers, but the details didn't fit. A single night, a single bed, and a check-in date that coincided with one of her late nights at work. Then came the texts. Her phone was synced to the laptop, and while most of her messages were innocuous, one thread stood out. It was labeled with a single letter, R. The conversation was brief, but intimate, filled with half-finished sentences and inside jokes. The kind of familiarity that comes from something deeper than friendship. My blood ran cold when I read the last message she'd sent before leaving for yoga. Can't wait to see you later. Same place. Who the hell was R? And where was same place? I leaned back, my mind racing. This wasn't just a hunch anymore. It was a puzzle, and the pieces were starting to fit together. But I still didn't have the full picture. I needed to know where she was really going. The idea of following her felt like something out of a bad movie, but I didn't care. I waited until I was sure she'd had enough time to settle into her yoga routine and grab my keys. The drive to her usual yoga studio took less than 10 minutes. And when I arrived, I parked across the street, scanning the entrance for any sign of her. Nothing. I waited for 20 minutes, then 30. People came and went, women in leggings, mats slung over their shoulders, but Emma was nowhere to be seen. That's when I spotted it. Her car, parked 2 blocks away, outside a small coffee shop. Inside, sitting at a table by the window, was Emma. She wasn't alone. It wasn't the coffee shop itself that caught my attention. It was the way Emma sat there, perched on the edge of her seat, her hands fidgeting with the coffee cup in front of her. She wasn't scrolling through her phone or casually reading a book like someone enjoying a solo break. No, her body language screamed anticipation. Then he arrived. A man walked in, dressed sharp but understated, with the kind of effortless confidence that made people notice. Emma's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. She stood to greet him, their movements too familiar to be mistaken for strangers or casual acquaintances. He leaned in, and though they didn't kiss, the closeness between them was unmistakable. My first instinct was to storm in, to blow up whatever fantasy world she'd built with this guy. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the surrealness of the moment, watching the life I thought I knew unravel from a distance. Or maybe it was the growing realization that this wasn't just about me catching her in the act. It was about understanding why. I stayed in the car, my heart pounding, as they sat down and started talking. From my angle, I couldn't hear a word, but their body language told the story. The leaning in, the occasional touch of his hand on hers. It all felt calculated. Intimate. I needed more. I wasn't going to act on half-truths and assumptions. So, I grabbed my phone and took a few discreet photos, ensuring I had a record of this meeting. Then, an idea struck me. The radio. Emma had already used it as her confessional booth once. What if I could do the same? I wasn't going to call the show myself. That would be too obvious. But I knew they offered an option for anonymous tips and voice submissions. People sent in their stories all the time, and the producers played them during the show, inviting the audience to weigh in. I decided to flip the narrative. That night, I recorded a message. I kept my voice steady, my tone measured, as I recounted what I'd seen that day and what I suspected it meant. I didn't name Emma or her lover, referring to them only as my wife and the other man. I ended the recording with a single question for the listeners. What would you do if the person you trusted most became a stranger overnight? Submitting the clip felt like throwing a stone into a still pond, unsure of how far the ripples would spread. I didn't know if they'd use it or if Emma would ever hear it. But it gave me a sense of control in a situation where I'd felt powerless. The next day, everything escalated. Emma came home later than usual, her hair slightly disheveled and the faint smell of cologne clinging to her clothes. I didn't ask where she'd been. Instead, I watched her closely, noticing the subtle shift in her demeanor. She seemed lighter, almost giddy, like someone carrying a secret they were too proud to share. What she didn't know was that I'd already taken the first steps toward uncovering that secret. The photos, the emails, the recording, all of it was building toward something bigger. But the real wild card was the radio show. That night, as we sat in the living room, her scrolling through her phone, me pretending to read a book, the show started playing. It was just background noise at first, the usual parade of callers sharing their love lives with a mix of humor and heartbreak. But then my clip came on. The host introduced it as a particularly thought-provoking story and invited the audience to listen closely. My voice filled the room, recounting everything I'd seen and felt. Emma froze. Her eyes darted to the radio, then to me, searching for a reaction. I didn't look up. The room felt suffocating as my voice echoed from the speakers. Every word hit like a hammer, breaking through the fragile silence that Emma clung to. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the edge of the couch as if holding on for dear life. The story was laid bare for all to hear. The anonymous man, me, describing his wife's betrayal in measured, deliberate tones. How he had stumbled upon her secrets in the most unexpected way. How he had seen her with another man, her laughter no longer shared with him, but stolen for someone else. Emma didn't say a word, but the flicker of panic in her eyes betrayed her. She knew. I kept my gaze fixed on my book, feigning indifference as the host weighed in on the situation. He called it a tragedy, a modern tale of deception, and invited listeners to call in with their thoughts. The irony was almost too much to bear. When the segment ended, the tension in the room was unbearable. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice trembling as she asked if I wanted to talk about what we'd just heard. I closed my book with deliberate calm and turned to her. Do you? Her mouth opened then closed. She didn't know where to start, and honestly, neither did I. So I decided to start where it hurt the most. Who is he? She recoiled like I'd struck her. Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't in the mood for theatrics. This wasn't about her feelings anymore. This was about the truth, no matter how much it stung. At first, she denied it. She tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that the man I saw was just a friend. But I wasn't interested in lies. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos from the coffee shop, the messages I'd found on her laptop, the hotel reservation under her name. Her mask crumbled. Emma broke down, confessing in fragmented sentences that felt like shards of glass. His name was Ryan. They'd met months ago at a networking event. It had started as innocent conversations, but somewhere along the line, it had spiraled into something more. She claimed she didn't mean for it to happen, that she still loved me, that she was confused. But I'd heard enough. I stood, my voice calm but firm. You weren't confused when you called into that radio show. You weren't confused when you lied to my face. You weren't confused when you booked that hotel room. She begged me to listen, to let her explain, but I wasn't interested in explanations. I wanted closure. I wanted out. I left the house that night, checking into a hotel without telling her where I was going. While Emma was busy drowning in the wreckage of her own lies, I was already planning my next move. Before falling asleep, I emailed the radio show anonymously, attaching the photos, the messages, and a copy of the hotel booking confirmation. I framed it as a follow-up to the story they'd aired, letting their audience know how the anonymous man had confronted the betrayal. The next morning, the radio host emailed me back, asking for permission to share the update. I agreed. By the end of the day, Emma's secret wasn't just exposed, it was immortalized. Her name wasn't mentioned, but the details were specific enough that anyone close to us would put the pieces together. Her perfect world was now in shambles, and the truth she tried so hard to hide was out there for everyone to see. And me? For the first time in months, I felt free. The fallout was swift and merciless, like a firestorm consuming everything in its path. By the time I returned to the house to collect my things, Emma's world was unrecognizable. Her meticulously curated life, her spotless reputation, her carefully managed social circles, had disintegrated under the weight of her lies. The radio show aired the update 2 days after I sent the evidence. It became an instant sensation, spreading like wildfire across social media. Listeners debated every detail, dissecting the layers of betrayal with morbid fascination. While her name wasn't mentioned, those who knew her had no trouble connecting the dots. I didn't need to confront her again. Her friends did it for me. Texts and voicemails poured in from people who felt betrayed, not by what she did to me, but by how she had deceived all of them. Her family was horrified, especially her parents, who called me repeatedly to apologize for raising someone capable of this. Emma, once the social glue of our community, was now the subject of whispers and sideways glances. Even Ryan, her lover, didn't stick around for long. According to a mutual acquaintance, he'd ghosted her as soon as the public scrutiny became too much. But I didn't stop there. This wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about reclaiming my narrative. I wrote an anonymous blog post detailing my experience, not as a sob story, but as a cautionary tale about trust, betrayal, and resilience. It struck a chord with thousands of readers, some of whom shared their own stories in the comments. As the weeks went by, something strange happened. The anger and pain that had consumed me began to fade. The more I talked about what happened, whether through writing, therapy, or even casual conversations, the less power it had over me. Emma's betrayal no longer defined me. The final piece of closure came when I sold the house. Walking through those empty rooms one last time, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, yes, for the life I thought I had, but also relief, knowing I was finally free to leave the past behind. I moved to a new city, a fresh start in every sense of the word. My new apartment was modest but full of potential, just like me. I filled it with things that made me happy, artwork from local artists, plants I actually remembered to water, and a desk where I could write without distraction. One day, I received an unexpected email. It was from the radio show's producer, thanking me for my story and offering me a guest spot on an upcoming episode about resilience after betrayal. I laughed at the irony, but declined. I didn't need to tell my story again. It was already out there, and I had nothing left to prove. As I sit here now, typing this final chapter, I feel a sense of peace I never thought I'd find. Emma's choices hurt me deeply, but they also forced me to confront truths about myself and my life that I might have otherwise ignored. The scars are still there, faint but visible. They're reminders not of the pain, but of my strength, of what I endured, of how I rebuilt, of the person I became in the aftermath. And to anyone reading this who has been through something similar, let me leave you with this. The betrayal isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning of a new one that you get to write for yourself. As I close the chapter on that part of my life, I realized something unexpected. Betrayal doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. It strips away the illusions, the excuses, the compromises, and leaves you with the raw, unfiltered truth about who you are and what you stand for. Emma's lies didn't define me. My response to them did. And while she'll forever live in the shadow of her own choices, I've stepped into the light, stronger and more certain of myself than ever. Sometimes, life doesn't give you the closure you think you need. Sometimes, you have to create it for yourself. And when you do, it's not just freeing, it's transformative. I didn't just survive her betrayal. I thrived because of it. And in the end, That's the kind of revenge you don't just savor, you celebrate.